Are you looking for ways to strengthen your marriage? Would you like to raise children you enjoy being around? Do you long for a peaceful, orderly home that's a blessing to everyone who comes through its doors? Then you've come to the right place. I'm Jennifer Flanders, a Bible-believing, homeschooling mother to 12 and host of the Loving Life at Home podcast. Join me as we discover what God's Word has to say about marriage, motherhood, and minding the things that matter most. Hello, friend. Welcome to episode 92 of Loving Life at Home. Today, I'd like to talk about parenting, and specifically all the unexpected blessings and benefits that come from raising children, especially when you have a bunch of them. Last month, the CDC released new data that indicates the general fertility rate has hit an all-time low in the U.S. recently. That GFR number is a little bit different than the national birth rate. It's the average births per woman between the ages of 15 and 44, I believe, and that number is apparently a better indicator of a country's population trend than the annual birth rate, which may fluctuate a little bit more from year to year. So the US General Fertility Rate is now sitting at an average of 1.6 children per woman during all of her childbearing years, which is well below the replacement level of 2.1 or 2.2 children per woman, and that spells trouble for our country. This announcement was made last week about the same time I was reading a book by Timothy Carney called Family Unfriendly. I'm not quite finished with it yet. I've only read 13 out of the 14 chapters, but it's been an interesting read so far. Carney is a Catholic father of 6, commenting on how our culture has made raising kids harder than it has to be, which is the subtitle of his book. He offers a lot of good food for thought, and I've found myself nodding in agreement to many, though not all, of his observations and suggested solutions. One thing that I found interesting is the fact that the birth rates across the globe continue to plummet, despite the fact that many countries are doing everything they can to encourage their citizens to procreate, including cash incentives, tax breaks, lengthy government-funded maternity and paternity leave, subsidized child care. The list goes on and on. But despite their best efforts, it hasn't significantly moved the needle. Couples who are inclined to have children in the first place may have them a bit earlier to take advantage of those governmental incentive programs, but couples who don't want children do not seem suddenly tempted to have a house full or even a single baby just because they'd get a bonus check for doing so. The only thing in my reading so far that seems to make a big difference in family size is when a couple has strong religious beliefs that highly value children, which is certainly the case for me and my husband, or they are completely surrounded by a community who highly values children. So I'm going to start with that first idea and then circle back to the second in a little bit. The Bible presents children as an unequivocally good thing. Depending on which Bible translation you're reading, Psalm 127, 3 through 5 calls them a gift, a heritage, a blessing, and a reward. So if we want to align our hearts with the heart of God, which should be our desire, then we must view children in the same way He does. And in fact, that has always been my goal. I love children, and I've wanted a bunch of them for as long as I can remember. Not surprisingly, this fact significantly narrowed the field of potential marriage partners back when I was in college. If an interested classmate so much as invited me to grab a cup of coffee with them, I'd ask matter-of-factly, "That depends. How many children do you plan on having when you get married?" Subtlety has never been my strong suit. This line of questioning quickly scared off most would-be suitors, but I didn't want to risk falling in love with someone who didn't share my desire for a big family. So I held out, and my patience eventually paid off. Mr. Wright, hereafter known as my husband Doug, finally showed up a few weeks before graduation. Not only was he interested in me, but he also gave the desired response to all my questions and didn't seem intimidated by my asking them. The rest, as they say, is history. I married him 16 months later, got pregnant 2 weeks into our honeymoon, and spent the following quarter of a century either pregnant or nursing or both. Life as the mother of many has been every bit as blissful as I imagined. Sure, there have been lots of unexpected challenges, but there have also been plenty of unanticipated rewards. I wrote a blog blog post over a decade ago listing a bunch of benefits that we've reaped by having a big family. Some of the things I listed were a little tongue-in-cheek, as you will see in a minute when I start sharing my favorites. But some of the blessings we've reaped from having a big family fill my heart with so much gratitude, it would be impossible to ever completely plumb its depths. And still other benefits have presented themselves now that I didn't even realize were in store for us when I first started compiling the list. So let's discuss them all one by one. First on my list was something I called expanded options. Granted, I wouldn't recommend having a bunch of kids only to keep from having to decide on a single name, but that is definitely a perk of giving birth a dozen times over. There are so many beautiful names with so many wonderful meanings out there. It's difficult to narrow down that list of favorites to pick just one. So you have to either do what one of my great-grandmothers did and saddle one child with a dozen different names. She gave her first son a moniker a mile long, but then my grandfather was born, and I guess there was no unused options available for him because the family just called him Pete until he was old enough to choose his own name, which is exactly what he did. The story goes that one day when his mother was trying to get his attention, he told her, "If you'll call me John, I'll answer." And he went by John for the rest of his life. Of course, having a big family completely solves that quandary. You can use all your favorite names, or in our case, almost all. I never did give birth to a Hannah, without needing to bestow a long string of names upon a solitary child. By the way, Hannah was the girl's name that my husband and I had picked out during 4 successive pregnancies that all ended up with my delivering sons. Then by the time I finally got a girl, about 5 or 6 of our friends had all named their daughters Hannah, so we went with Rebecca instead. But even though I never had a baby of my own named Hannah Flanders, we do have a grandbaby with that name, so that makes me happy. Incidentally, I'm not the only person that sees the idea of expanded options for naming babies as a blessing. My son Ben and his wife Michaela just announced the fact 2 weeks ago that they're expecting again. They already have 4, so this will be number 5 for them. And Michaela came over last week to get my opinion on 4 different names that they're considering this time around. 2 of them are decidedly boy names and 2 are equally distinctive girl names. But here's the catch. She told me she didn't just want me to pick a favorite. She wanted to know what order of those 4 particular names I thought sounded best because they want to eventually use all of them. Hearing her say that made me laugh. First of all, because it tells me she's on board for having at least 8 children, which is totally awesome. But second, because the idea of planning beforehand the order of gender-specific baby names without knowing the sexes of the babies receiving those names just struck me as funny. So I told her I thought that the order should depend entirely upon whether a particular pregnancy resulted in a son or daughter. I simply recommended she use her favorite boy name for the first boy, her favorite girl name for the first girl, and so on, adjusting as necessary if they didn't wind up with an even split. We'll see how it goes and what they ultimately decide. I love all 4 names they've picked for the kids already, as well as the 4 that they've chosen for the future babies, but I'm hoping maybe they'll find several other names too that will keep them growing their family even beyond 8. Benjamin used to tell me that he wanted 16 children. He even spent time as a teen designing a modified van that would allow him to tote the whole family of 18 in a single vehicle. In fact, when he first started dating his wife, a family friend who I think was interested in Ben herself tried to scare Michaela off at a Christmas party both were attending by telling her how many kids Ben was hoping to have. So good luck to whoever marries him, right? The girl told Mick. But Michaela was undeterred. And here they are a few years later expecting their 5th and hoping for at least 3 more beyond that. The second blessing I see to living in a big family is that it's an antidote to boredom. There is never a dull moment in a home filled with children, and there is always somebody to play with. Neighbors and schoolmates will come and go, but siblings or friends that you can keep for life. Now, when I was growing up, it was common for parents to turn their children loose in the neighborhood with instructions to come back home when the streetlights turned on at dusk. We had so much freedom. Back when I was in grade school, I would walk to and from school all week long. Then on Saturday, I'd pack a lunch, hop on my bike, and leave home early in the morning to ride all by myself down to the park and hike along the creek hunting tadpoles or play on the jungle gym at the playground and pretend I was exploring a new planet or stranded on a desert island. Or I'd go to the neighborhood pool to swim or climb as high up in a tree as I could possibly reach and then perch in its branches to read a book. I have one sister, and although she eventually married a man who loves to hike and takes her with him as much as he can, back when we were kids, she was not nearly as fond of exploring or scaling trees or wading through muddy creeks or catching frogs or lizards or tadpoles or fish as I was, so I usually did that kind of thing alone, which I suppose proves that you don't absolutely have to have a bunch of siblings to keep from ever feeling bored, because I barely ever remember feeling bored in my entire life. But sadly, we are living in a much different era now than the one I grew up in. And if I let one of my kids spend the whole day at the park alone and unsupervised, somebody might turn me in to CPS for child neglect or endangerment. Not that unsupervised play really is dangerous or negligent, but that we live in a society that seems to think so nowadays. Fortunately, there's safety in numbers, and while I wouldn't feel comfortable turning a young child loose to spend Saturday afternoon hiking through the woods or wading through streams, I have absolutely no problem allowing a group of my children to do exactly that, which has allowed them to experience a lot more of the same freedoms and adventures and opportunities to explore and grow and investigate that I so enjoyed as a child, and that makes my heart happy. When they were younger, they'd all hop on their bikes and ride to the neighborhood pool to swim, or to the bookstore to browse, or to the gas station to get a treat, or to the craft store to buy supplies for some creative project they wanted to make, or to something they called the bamboo forest to cut long poles for teepees. They still like to go to the bamboo forest, in fact, which was just a dense grove of bamboo that grew near a creek in our old neighborhood. And earlier this summer, they went again and brought home 2 10-foot poles to use as supports for a movie screen so we can host an outdoor movie for our family and friends this fall once the Texas weather cools off a little bit. Now that they're older, they don't just ride bikes around town either. They also get in the car and drive further away to visit their grandmother or married siblings in other towns. Just last month, 5 of the unmarried kids, actually 4 of my kids plus 1 grandchild who's just a couple of months older than my youngest son, flew to California together to explore several national parks. They saved up their money and they all bought their own plane tickets, took lots of pictures while they were there, and made wonderful memories together. But all that adventuring started with just a bike ride around the block or to the pool, which meant crossing one busy street by themselves. Parents who helicopter and micromanage and plan out every minute of their offspring's childhood rob them of the growth that comes from doing some things, not everything, but some things, independently and on their own. Each new adventure builds a little more confidence so that when the time comes, they aren't afraid to tackle bigger escapades and more daunting challenges. And having a house full of siblings gave everyone plenty of buddies to bring along on those adventures without forcing anybody who was more of a homebody, like my sister was as a child, out of their own comfort zone prematurely. 3, another benefit that big families enjoy, well, maybe not all of them enjoy this, but we normally do, is the knack our large crew has for starting conversations. Big families invite all sorts of inquiries. Are all these kids yours? Don't you know what causes that? Are you going to have any more? Do I need to buy you a TV? In our experience, most of the people asking such questions aren't trying to be rude. They're genuinely curious. And so we answer just as graciously and amicably as we possibly can. What a great way to meet people. Our willingness to engage such folks and answer their questions has led to a lot of newspaper articles, especially on homeschooling, and TV interviews. First, it was just for our local papers and news stations, but eventually that led to our being interviewed by Al Jazeera's America Tonight, and that led to the BBC contacting us about appearing in a documentary with a British actress named Miriam Margolyes, which we did, and we're still in contact with her all these years later. I'll include links to both those interviews in today's show notes. Even ABC's 2020 came out and filmed our family along with some good friends of ours, the Halberstats, who now have 10 children, although I think they only had 6 or 7 at the time of the interview. But to my knowledge, none of that footage has ever aired. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." I view having a large family as an opportunity to put this verse into practice, which is why I'm always happy to answer questions about why we've made the life decisions we've made, whether the person asking me the question is standing behind me in the grocery line, or eating at a table near ours in a restaurant, or thrusting a microphone in my face with lights blaring and cameras rolling. It's all the same to me, and if you're willing to ask the questions, I'm willing to answer them in the best, most God-honoring way I know how. Another benefit to big family living is built-in group discounts. A really big family can qualify for discounted group admission rates without even trying. And do we ever get our money's worth on all those annual zoo and museum memberships, especially the ones that offer reciprocal benefits at sister sites, which often means free museum admission whenever we travel. For years, I'd planned potty breaks on road trips to coincide with museum or zoo or botanical garden visits so that we're stopping every 3 to 4 hours on the road at some reciprocal site that gives us free admission. I talk about that more in my episode on family travel. I'll look that up and link it in the show notes if you're interested. Also, whenever we travel en masse with extended family, I try to take advantage of as many kids-eat-free restaurants as I can. Even though most restaurants understandably limit free kids' meals to one per paying adult, we usually have enough diners ages 13 and up in our group to get all the little ones fed for free. I keep a couple of lists on my website, which I'll also link in the show notes. One of local restaurants here in Tyler, Texas, where we live, and another of national chains like Freebirds and Luby's, where kids eat free on certain days of the week. And even though all my children have now aged out of those promotions, we still refer to it whenever the grandkids are in town or we have a reunion in another city. Then, number 5, deeper admiration. The love and affection I felt for my husband as a spouse, great though it was, increased manifold when he became the father of my children. I so enjoyed watching him teach and train and interact with our preschoolers, adolescents, teens, and adult children, but there was something especially endearing about the way he cuddled and coochie-cooed our babies, and it made me so glad that for so long we had a little one in the house to draw that tenderness out of him. He's still that way with grandchildren. They all adore him and attend to his voice the moment he walks in our room. Number 6 is household help. A wise man once observed, many hands make light labor. He was right. Of course, many hands make bigger messes to begin with, too. But when everyone pitches in to help clean up, household chores are knocked out in short order, and kids learn responsibility and other important life skills from an early age. It's fun to work side by side to accomplish daily tasks and then be able to play side by side, making wonderful family memories. Now, let me pause here to interject something that I think should be obvious, but evidently isn't. I just want to acknowledge the fact that children create a lot more messes than they clean up, at least in the beginning. But if you do your job and train them well, they will eventually get much better at cleaning up after themselves, which is a huge help to any homemaker. I say this because whenever I've written about assigning children's chores on my blog, and I'll link a few of those posts in the show notes, I get messages from readers who tell me I'm robbing my kids of their childhood, or they say things like, well, it's obvious you only wanted a bunch of kids because you wanted free slave labor, which would be laughable if they weren't 100% serious, which is utter nonsense. That would be like saying I only teach algebra so I can copy off my students' homework. Only a person who doesn't understand math would ever suggest such a thing. But I do understand math. In fact, I love math. So 1, I can easily do all my computations without cheating off anybody else's work. Thank you very much. And 2, I know that if I don't do my job teaching algebra well, none of my students would be turning in homework worth copying anyway. The same is true for kids and chores. Only someone who doesn't have children or doesn't understand what is involved in raising children would suggest that any parent would have a whole house full of kids so as to have extra help keeping said house nice and tidy. That is ludicrous. As I already mentioned, several of our single kids, including almost all the ones still living at home, Daniel had to work, so he didn't make the trip, and neither did Isaac, who's doing an engineering internship in Longview this summer. And, of course, Rachel is still in Germany for 1 more month working as an au pair, so none of those 3 went. But the rest of the singles spent a week in California hiking through national parks. And my husband and I were absolutely amazed at how clean the house stayed for the 6 days that they were gone. We barely had any laundry. There were no dirty dishes piled up in the sink, ever. We hardly messed anything up or had any housework to do while they were away, so that part was great. However, the house was so quiet and lonely and still without all our kids in it, so we were overjoyed and relieved when they all made it back safely, despite the fact that they brought a ton of dirty clothes home with them. Because we really love our children and we enjoy spending time with them. Yes, they're able to wash those dirty clothes themselves now, and they'll often load the dishwasher or wipe down the countertops or straighten the house as well. And all those are nice things, but let's not forget that many of those things would not need to be done at all if the kids weren't living in our home in the first place. Proverbs 14:4 tells us, "Where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much increase comes by the strength of the ox." And the same is true for children. Where there are no kids, the house stays tidy, but much joy comes through the presence of children. That's because our lives are greatly enriched by our large family. Free slave labor? That is not an efficient business model. But if someone were to suggest that we had a passel of kids because we enjoy having a house full of amazing humans to do life with, to talk to and spend time with and make memories together and be challenged and stretched and sharpened by, that would be a far more accurate statement. I'm never going to get through all these benefits if I don't pick up the pace. Next on my list is number 7, no PMS. Between pregnancy and breastfeeding, you can literally go for years without having a monthly cycle. This is experience talking, and I'm not going to lie, that was really, really nice while it lasted. Also, so many pregnancies allowed me to save up my eggs. A woman is born with only a limited number, so I didn't end up going through menopause or have to deal with any of the side effects that normally accompany that change in life until I was 57 years old, which was also nice in my opinion. Number 8, pick your sport. Depending on the size of your family, you can field your own basketball team, or volleyball, or baseball, or soccer. The physical exercise does a body good, and the games give ample opportunity to practice good sportsmanship among other players who are held to the same standard. We've always had a very competitive family, but it's a friendly sort of competition where each child cheers on the others. Playing sports or even board games and card games is a great way to be alerted to and work out character flaws. And when our kids were little, my husband hit on a great way to do just that. We'd play games nearly every night after dinner. Sometimes we'd grab a basketball to play knockout in the driveway. Sometimes we'd play zombie tag in the backyard. Or if it rained, we'd stay inside and play spoons or maybe bananagrams at the kitchen table or around the world ping pong in the garage. But we'd play together consistently as soon as the kitchen chores were done after dinner. And if anyone got mad or upset or lost their temper or tried to cheat or showed any other sign of poor sportsmanship, he or she would get to be the, quote, guest speaker when we came back inside for story time that evening. We have a topical arrangement of Proverbs called Proverbs for Parenting, so we'd flip over to the appropriate section of the book and have that child read relevant verses on anger or impatience or greed or unkindness or whatever the present problem happened to be. Sometimes, sad to say, even mom or dad had to take a turn as a guest speaker because ours was the most egregious behavior for that day's game playing. Another benefit of having a big family is social security. Contrary to what zero population growth proponents will tell you, demographic declines are causing deeply troubling problems for societies worldwide, which is why many countries, including Germany, Japan, Australia, among others, are now actually paying people to have children. Big families are simply ahead of the curve. And in our case, with 12 children, my husband has always teased that when we get too old or feeble to care for ourselves, we can rotate houses and spend 1 month with each child so that nobody needs to feel unduly burdened by our care. Hopefully, it won't ever come to that, or at least not for a long, long time, because the 10th benefit to having a big family is a fountain of youth. While pregnancy keeps you looking young, think thick, glossy hair and glowing complexion, the children themselves keep you feeling young. It is a wonderful thing to see the world through the eyes of a child, so filled with awe and excitement over each new discovery. Their energy, enthusiasm, and laughter are infectious. And keeping up with them, whether it's playing frisbee or taking bike rides or running foot races or hiking through national parks, which is something the whole family normally does together, my husband's work schedule just wouldn't allow us to accompany those older ones this summer. We already have made plans to take another 3-day hike in November together, though, and we're going to be going tent camping for a week in October. But keeping up with the kids in whatever form that takes helps keep us on our toes and physically fit. As for the youthful appearance, I know lots of large families where mom and dad look more like their children's siblings than their parents. One of my husband's favorite stories happened when our oldest daughter was in college and he drove to campus to change cars with her. Several of her friends saw him talking to her and giving her a hug as they traded keys, and they came rushing over as soon as Doug left to ask Bethany who the cute guy was. They thought Doug was her boyfriend and were shocked to find out that he was her dad because he, quote, looks so young. Number 11 on my list of unexpected benefits to having lots of children is one less excuse. Being open to pregnancy allows couples to enjoy intimacy as God intended. No frantic search for a misplaced diaphragm. No mad dash to the drugstore when you run out of condoms. No having to compensate for the fact that the pill completely decimates a woman's libido. Just blessed spontaneity, although regularly scheduling time for said spontaneity is highly recommended. Then number 12 is no sour milk. In a house full of kids, especially teenage boys, food seldom lasts long enough to go bad. That's a plus. You can buy it in bulk without fear of spoilage. For several years, when my oldest boys were teens, we'd buy 10 gallons of milk at a time, and it would last us only 4 days. If it were just my husband and I drinking it, I don't think we could finish a full gallon before it went bad. Same is true for eggs and bread. Neither of those staples normally last long enough to go bad at our house. And as an added bonus, dinner conversation never drags with so many different personalities contributing to it. Number 13, having lots of kids means you'll eventually have built-in babysitters. Our kids absolutely love babies and are always clamoring to hold our newest edition. As a result, they can all handle infants very comfortably and capably, experience that has definitely come in handy once they started having kids of their own. Several of our daughters-in-law were the youngest in their family and had little to no experience caring for infants before they had their own babies. So having a husband who knew how to hold and swaddle and change and burp a baby was a huge help and a reassuring comfort to them as new moms. Now, just to clarify, when I say built-in babysitters, I am not talking about parents expecting their older children to raise the younger ones. This isn't about shirking your job or pushing the hard work of parenting off on somebody else to do, especially not on older siblings who are still children themselves. It has always been my responsibility and the responsibility of my husband to care for our babies, to feed them, provide for their needs, change their diapers, bathe them, teach them, train them, watch over them, make sure they learn right from wrong, that sort of thing. But there's a big difference between not leaning on your children to do your job and not allowing them to interact with the baby at all. You have to strike a balance. I know it drove some of the grandmothers we know crazy to watch us pass the baby around from person to person and child to child. The more babies we had, the more older siblings were constantly at our elbows clamoring for their turn to hold them. And I really think that one reason our kids are still so close is that they were allowed to be involved with the babies from the get-go, holding them, rocking them, entertaining them. One of our sons, Samuel, begged us to install a baby carrier on his bicycle so he could pump his little brother around the neighborhood. Another son, Benjamin, would spend his own money buying little clothes for his baby brother so they could match whenever we went out. Another son, David, would whisk Abigail out of my arms nearly every Sunday morning just as church started. We always kept our babies with us in the service, and he would sit with her in his lap, and if she started to squirm, he'd just look at her sideways and she'd settle right back down. It was incredible and good training for him, too, because now he has 3 little girls of his own plus 1 little boy, and they all respond to his instruction just as consistently as his little sister did. I never asked or expected him to do that. Just like with other children, I didn't ask or expect them to pump the kids around the block or buy their clothes or any of that stuff. They just volunteered. And in the case of David, oh my, when he left for dental school, Abby missed him so much. Whenever he'd come home to visit, he'd ask to be the one to wake her up in the morning, and she would just squeal with delight as soon as she laid eyes on him. Whenever we did school, the older kids would each take a turn playing with the little ones while I went over math lessons with their school-age siblings. They'd build blanket tents for them in the living room, or feed them snacks, or take them in the backyard to swing. I felt a little conflicted about assigning them the, quote, chore of watching their younger siblings this way, even though it was only for half an hour each, but that was the easiest way I could think of to make sure everyone got their schoolwork done and the littles weren't neglected during the process. But then one morning, I overheard my boys arguing about something that let me know they did not view this half hour of babysitting as a chore at all, but as a privilege. On that particular day, Ben had claimed the 7:30 to 8 a.m. time slot, but was precisely 2 minutes late handing the baby over to the next in line. So Samuel had to arbitrate. That means I get her till 8:34, and then David can have her till 9:06. They didn't want to miss even a minute or two of playing with that baby. And as an added bonus, our big guys quickly discovered that nothing attracts attention from the opposite sex more effectively than toting around a new baby brother or sister, otherwise known as a chick magnet. So closer sibling relationships were not the only benefit they derived from developing great baby skills. Another benefit to having a big family is that having a lot of children can help each child learn to put their best foot forward. Not only do children help refine their parents' character qualities, but they polish one another as well. Proverbs 27:17 tells us, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And I've definitely seen that principle at work within the four walls of our own home. Siblings have a way of knocking off one another's rough edges in private, so they're less likely to make fools of themselves in public. Corny jokes and lame pranks can be tested, then reworked as needed, or altogether abandoned at home, where the stakes are lower and the audience is more forgiving. Homeschoolers are sometimes stereotyped as being socially awkward or unsocialized, but that has not been our experience. Most of the homeschoolers we know, including our own kids, are articulate and gregarious and able to carry on interesting conversations with a wide range of ages, not just with their peers. And I think that's largely due to the fact that they get so much practice relating to old and young alike within our own family, instead of spending 8 hours a day sequestered in a classroom surrounded only by their age mates. In fact, with so many children spread over so many years, a large family really forms its own microculture, which is especially handy if you're interested in bucking societal norms. For instance, if the parents of an only child were to decide, I think 8 or 10 or 12 years old is much too young to own a phone, and I don't want my son or daughter to spend their whole childhood staring at a screen. And those are entirely reasonable concerns, by the way. But an only child will not really get the results you might be hoping to achieve by waiting to give her a phone, or refusing to buy him a gaming console, or by suggesting they spend more time playing outdoors. Because now, instead of staring at her own screen, if all her little friends are still glued to their phones, she'll wind up staring at the tops of their heads while they scroll at the lunch table, or on the school playground, or at church youth group, or wherever else the kids tend to congregate. If you want to create a culture of screen-free kids who actually talk to one another and play outside with one another and go exploring together, you've either got to get a whole lot more parents on board setting similar guidelines for their own kids to make it happen, or you've got to raise more kids yourself so that those siblings will all have built-in playmates. That's what I mean by this idea of a large family creating its own microculture within the home. Your decisions about how your kids will or won't spend their time, the amount of TV and YouTube and movie streaming that you allow, the use or non-use of social media or video games, whether or not you eat refined sugar or participate in travel sports or go to slumber parties or have evening curfews or require household chores or participate in homeschool co-ops or attend church on Sundays, all those decisions and more affect the whole crew. And so they are all in it together and adapt accordingly, which is really a helpful thing that makes it so much easier to resist the pressure society tends to exert on parents to raise their children in a certain way. If I decide I don't want to spend my time shuffling kids back and forth from one extracurricular activity to another, guess what? I don't have to, and they will still have things to do and people to play with. Whereas if the parent of an only child decides to avoid what Timothy Carney calls the travel team trap, he may be the only kid in the neighborhood on a given Saturday because all his little friends are involved in out-of-town games themselves. So that's been a benefit of having a bunch of kids. Another big blessing is the fact that having a lot of children means you won't have to deal with an empty nest as soon as you might otherwise. I love this fact. Also, when you're blessed with many children, you don't have to give up all your favorite things about one stage of life to enjoy the great things about the next. You still have little ones at home to cuddle even after the first ones move away. That's a happy distraction during what would otherwise be a bittersweet time. Also, studies show that the older a couple is when their last child leaves home, the more likely their marriage will survive the transition. I wholeheartedly agree with what John wrote in his third epistle. I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. That's 3 John 1:4. It has been great watching our children grow up and mature into such amazing adults. They eventually become more like really good friends. They are also thoughtful and kind and smart and interesting and articulate and witty. I often feel compelled to just take notes whenever I talk to them. But I'm also grateful to still have a few children left at home, although even those were perched on the edge of the nest ready to fledge and fly away very, very soon. And it will be a little bittersweet when that happens, signaling the end, as it were, of such a wonderfully rich and rewarding season of my life. The last benefit I want to mention is the potential impact a big family has on the people around them. I don't just mean pointing others to Jesus or loving your neighbors as you love yourself or trying to make the world a better place. Those are all things that Christians can do whether they have a house full of children or just one or two or no kids at all. Our circumstances are all different, and we can all purpose to glorify God no matter what those circumstances are. Whether we get to spend our lives doing what we always dreamed of doing, or our lives take a detour and we wind up with plan B or even plan C or D. The impact I'm talking about here is specific to having a bunch of kids. It can actually serve to encourage and motivate other families to buck the current 1.6 accepted average of a normal-sized family as well. I've lost count of how many of my husband's colleagues have confided in him over the years that they had originally planned to stop at 1 or 2 or maybe 3 kids, but when they saw our family keep having baby after baby after baby, we were expecting our 6th when we first moved to town, and we doubled that number by the time it was all said and done. It convinced them to keep going as well. That phenomenon was something that showed up in the research that Timothy Carney did for that book I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Other than having deeply held religious convictions yourself that view children in a favorable light, one of the strongest predictors of larger family size is living in a community where larger families are common and children are valued. The author visited Orthodox Jewish communities, Mormon neighborhoods, and cul-de-sacs populated primarily by large Catholic families, and found that average family size, even of non-religious couples, shifted up when those families were surrounded by other large families. When everyone you know has only 1 or 2 kids, choosing to raise 5 or 6 may seem excessive, but when you know families with 10, 11, 12, or more children, having 5 or 6 seems much more acceptable, almost as if you're just getting started. Thanks so much for listening today. If you have a question you'd like to hear covered on this podcast, message me on Instagram at Flanders_family or contact me through my website, lovinglifeathome.com. Before you go, if you've been encouraged by something you've heard on the show, do me a favor and forward the link to a friend or head over to Loving Life at Home on Apple iTunes to subscribe and leave a written review of the show. Your doing so will help others find me so they can listen too. Until next time, I pray the Lord will bless your efforts to build a loving home life centered on Him.